Ecology and Case Studies. And our first speaker is Vic Morfin from the U.S. Forest Service. The topic is the good, the bad, and the Smoky, a Sitgreaves fire case study.
Thank you, and welcome everyone to this presentation. My name is Vic Morfin. I'm the Forest Fuel Specialist for the Coconino National Forest out of Flagstaff. And on this fire, I was the Incident Commander Type 3 for the Sitgreaves fire. And James Pettit, the local FMO there at Williams, was the ICT-3 trainee. Want to talk about what type of fire this was. It was not a planned ignition or a prescribed fire. It was an unplanned or wildfire. However, due to the strategy we took, it kind of falls in between the two types of fire that we have. A few years ago, this would be called the wildland fire use, but that's an obsolete term, so I'll try not to say it again. The reason I bring that up is smoke-wise, there's definitely a distinction. Planned ignitions, prescribed fire, are regulated in Arizona by Arizona Department of Environmental Quality. Wildfires are not. And then in terms of smoke tolerance, smoke acceptance, tolerance for our prescribed fire in terms of smoke complaints and whatnot seems to be pretty low, generally speaking, with the public. On the other hand, wildfires, there doesn't seem to be that sensitivity or that criticism, at least as a practitioner. That's my perception. And so this fire was somewhere in the middle. Okay, smoke, in my mind, is an unnecessary, unwanted byproduct of fire. In other words, if we're going to restore fire to these fire-adapted landscapes, we're going to have smoke. It's a matter of how we manage that smoke, but it's going to be there. And my fire staff once heard someone say that it's the premium we pay for an insurance policy. So it might be something different to you, but that's one way of looking at smoke. Okay, kind of the rundown of when I was called to be the ICT-3 of this fire, my initial thoughts went to the pumpkin fire. Some of you in this room may remember that in 2000 we had a wildfire up on Kendrick Mountain. Very similar. Around it is about 7,000 feet. It stands up about 3,000 feet above the surrounding topography. Just like Sitgreaves Mountain stands up about 2,500 feet above the surrounding terrain, kind of a cinder cone out there. And what I remember about this fire was a huge resource commitment. A Type 2 team in place for about 3 weeks, lots of hotshot crews, bulldozers, logging equipment, lots of aerial ignition, and consequently, the Spring Valley area and the Highway 180, Parks, Belmont, saw some of the worst smoke I've seen. I've lived in Flagstaff since 1990, and those were certainly some of the worst smoke impact days because of all that aerial ignition on this mountain. And so that's what I was thinking when I was called up to help be part of the team to manage this fire. This was a fire that the complexity was driven by smoke management due to a few reasons. One, obviously being right there along I-40. Another being that there was no road system on this mountain. There's roads that go up to it and dead end, partway up the hill, but nothing to bisect up the fire or to use tactically. Pretty much there's the road system in red. And heavy fuel loads. We're going up over 9,000 feet. Heavy fuels, to me, means heavy smoke. Primarily, I'm talking about ponderosa pine. That's what we were dealing with. The fire ended up being about 11,000 acres. The planning area was about 19,000. 7,000 to over 9,000 feet elevation. And I'll talk about it more later, but just to point out, the Eagle Rock fire from 2010 was in the northeast quadrant of our planning area. When this fire occurred, we were into monsoon season. It was early July, and we had already received about 4 inches of precip. So it was pretty wet when we got the start. Go through a chronology, a rundown. We're over I-40 now, looking north. First, we got the duck fire, July 7th. So immediately, the Williams Ranger District assembled an interdisciplinary team to talk about the values at risk, potential courses of action, draw in a planning area. But that was changed once we got the Sitgreaves fire, because it's a whole different scenario. Up here, that X should be downhill just a little bit, showing east of Road 63. With this fire, we had a clear point of no return. And what I mean by that, if we chose to manage it and let it grow, and we didn't go initial attack it right away, and that fire grew and got established, it was all or nothing. At that point, we had to take it around the mountain. There would no longer be an option to go put it out. So a whole different deal here. This fire ended up burning for about 6 weeks. In those 6 weeks, we adjusted our management. Generally, it was a type 4 fire through July and August, but we had a couple pulses of type 3 management, and so I showed up slightly before this to transition. It rained on about the 29th, and so we took a break for about 10 days, 2 weeks, and then we came back and finished what we started in August. Smoke management-wise, the duck fire was kind of a slam dunk. It's down in the flats, light fuels, lots of tactical options. You could see some natural barriers, a couple gas lines. You could go put a dozer line around it if you got tired of the smoke or you needed to put that fire out for any reasons. It's fairly typical of a lot of those types of fire, resource objective fires that we manage. On the other hand, Sitgreaves fire, we were committed to long-term smoke emissions. If we chose to let it, to manage it and to let it burn, sorta, then we were committed to the long term. And I want to talk a little bit about desires to shut it off. The practitioners in the room know what I'm getting towards. We hear a lot from internal and our partners and external folks about shutting it off. You know, they get tired of going to 0600 briefing, they get tired of all the meetings, they get tired of the smoke, whatever it is, a lot of smoke complaints. And they'll come to us after we've started managing a fire, and they'll want to be done with it and to go put it out. And a lot of you folks in this room know that's not an option on this fire. Okay, now we've swung around clockwise, looking back at the fire. Once the interdisciplinary team was reassembled for the Sitgreaves fire, they drew a planning area here, 19,000 acres, and essentially that's the road system around Sitgreaves. That's about the closest you have to work with a couple other options that you could use too, but that's the road system. This is that 2010 Eagle Rock fire that I referenced earlier, a stand replacement, high intensity wildfire. Most of that perimeter burned that first shift. And to point out, all the private property outlined in gray, those are private parcels. The smoke receptors we were dealing with were the communities along the I-40 corridor from Flagstaff to Williams. In addition, the roads themselves, I-40, Highway 180 from Flagstaff to the Grand Canyon. Grand Canyon's out here off the frame. And Williams, Highway 64 to the Grand Canyon. We knew that if we had smoke impacts to these roads, we ran the risk of traffic accidents or maybe something worse. It was just a risk that was out there. And last, not least, is the Verde Valley. Anyone who works in Arizona knows that the Verde Valley back here is very smoke sensitive. We have a lot of our conversations around smoke management. We talk about the Verde Valley, and we try to limit smoke in that Verde Valley. And we've learned from the past that in July and August, in 2009, we were managing fires here south of the interstate, and we had some north wind events come through and put a lot of smoke into the Verde Valley for fairly long periods of time. So we knew that that was a potential here. If we had north winds, we're not going to check it up at a road or do anything about it. It's going to blow our smoke into the Verde Valley for who knows how long. It's just a possibility. Fortunately, that didn't develop during those 6 weeks. And we also had smoke receptors in Spring Valley here, right up against our planning area. And the thing about this, why I outlined this fire, is because as we approached those folks to garner support for our operation, their thought was, their last image in their mind from a wildfire was this fire that started essentially in their backyard and ran through all their houses that first shift. So, you know, it's an emotional response. They're afraid of fire. And so we're not starting on a level playing field with those folks. We have a lot of convincing to do and whatnot to let them know that this fire isn't the Eagle Rock fire. and we're doing this to prevent future Eagle Rock fires. Okay, so for the first 3 weeks of July, right, monsoons had set in, it's cool, it's wet, it's cloudy, very non-threatening. I don't know if you can even see it, but there is the Sitgreaves fire. And that's literally after a couple weeks of burning. It was smaller than that, obviously, when it first started, just a single tree. Okay, so what are the fire and smoke management challenges? Are there any? I think there are, but they're not apparent. There's things we can be doing. And I call it painting the reality picture with our internal and our external partners and being transparent about the future. Not what they're looking at. It's pretty self-evident. We could lay maps on a table and tell them what we're planning, but this is what they're seeing. So it's hard to make that connection to what's coming. Okay, so it looks like this for most of July. And then the Incident Command Team 3, Vic and the boys show up. Oh, sorry. Just internal and external. So those are examples of where we want to be transparent about the future, and the sooner the better. And so, like I was saying, we showed up, and literally 2 or 3 days later, their mountain looks like this. They were looking at this just yesterday or the day before. So, and that's the view from I-40 in the city of Williams. So that's what they're probably thinking, right? What are we doing? You've lit up the whole mountain. You're destroying our mountain. And we got into some dialogue that the team had and the district had, but the whole leave it alone versus active management. There's certainly groups and folks out there that think that we need to let these things burn, let them burn naturally. I tend to be of the opinion over here, active management, and that this isn't the Selway Bitterroot. This isn't the Aldo Leopold Wilderness. There's infrastructure, there's different values where we're working. And the option to leave it alone isn't necessarily a good option in my mind. And I would say it comes down to risk management and exposure. That by actively managing fire, we're going to reduce the exposure for smoke, firefighter injuries, the risk of an escaped fire, the risk to the public, to public safety. And when I say that, I don't just mean traffic accidents, which is one, but also the risk of fire burning into their backyards, like they saw at the Eagle Rock fire. The risk of that happening in 5 years. And let's not forget about fire effects. We talked a lot about keeping this fire out of alignment. When we were putting fire on these ridges, you can kind of see that this is all backing fire. And that was deliberate, and it took time. And the reason we were doing that is we felt that if we left the fire alone, that at some point it's going to get down into drainage, get established, we'll have a higher wind day, a dry day, and it's going to nuke out a drainage, take out the mountain. And then for years, as folks drive I-40, Joe Public, elected politicians, people are going to see that scar and say, oh yeah, that's where the Forest Service wrecked that mountain. So we were conscientious of that potential failure or a bad outcome. And to me, this is kind of about ERTs, emission reduction techniques, used to be called best management practices. But when you do accelerated mass ignition, while you're meeting objectives, not just going and lighting it up, you are helping reduce smoke impacts. You're reducing that duration. In other words, we're going to have 11,000 acres burn of heavy fuels. Do you want that 11,000 acres burned over 3 months, 4 months, or do you want it over 6 days, 6 weeks? You're going to have that smoke. But if you can reduce the duration and do that during very good to excellent ventilation days, which generally July, August, you get a lot of that versus the fall, you're going to reduce those impacts. And so the ignition that was done on this fire, ground and aerial, it was a deliberate, systematic approach where we were trying to keep it out of alignment and stomp on the gas on those good ventilation days. That was thought out and discussed a lot versus we definitely had people, internal and external, talking about leave it alone. You shouldn't be doing that. And maybe they're right, but we did that. Okay, this is a progression map you're looking at. That green color outlined up in here was pretty much through the 3rd week of July. The first few days we lit those ridges like you saw of that photo. And we had a concern here. We wanted to tie into the Eagle Rock fire and keep that fire checked from spreading off to this private property on the north. And then we basically took it around the horn clockwise, brought it to here, and then went up to the Eagle Rock fire and brought it back down, just to give you a layout of how we went through firing. But the first priority with this fire and with all fires, prescribed or wildfires, is always focused on control. If we can't control the fire, we'll probably lose the license to burn or lose the license to manage fire. You have to control it first and foremost before you can worry about other things. So our first priority was securing this northeast, tie it into the Eagle Rock. We felt if we burned the 76 road down here to the 63 road, then we didn't have to worry as much about control. We would lock it in. At that point, our conversations with our ignition folks, our operations folks, aerial ignition, was more about bringing it around the horn and worrying about resource objectives, keeping the fire out of alignment, making sure the product we delivered to the forest was a good product. You know, it looked like a prescribed fire. That was our hope. And I think if you drive I-40 and look to the north, you'll see a mountain that looks pretty dang good. And I have not heard one person come back from that and say that they don't like what they see. A really good outcome. And that's pretty much I have. I want to leave time for questions. And special thanks to Holly Craig, the Williams Ranger District Fire Information Officer, for helping a technically challenged person incorporate Google images and do some fancy stuff. And Wesley helped me out also with those crazy animations. I guess I'd open it up for questions at this time. Yes, ma'am. Well, we had a public meeting early on, and I believe it was at the end of July. And James Pettit, the incident commander trainee, got up in front of him to start off. He's the local FMO. We knew he was going to be there for the long haul, not just a visitor like me. And he was real clear about, we talked about, this is minimum 6 weeks. It might rain tomorrow. It might get stalled for a week or a month. We're going to try to get done what we can get done, and the weather's going to give us what it's going to give us, but this is a long duration deal. And I think we were real clear with the public, and it was a weird public meeting. We actually got a round of applause at the end, and I'm not used to that. At least for prescribed fire or this type of fire, you know, wildfires kind of like heroes, regardless of the outcome.
Can I follow up? Did you say anything to them about health?
About?
Health.
Holly's shaking her head, yes, so we must have.
We have the ADEQ color chart that has 5 or 6 different colors on it, and it says for each rating what it is, and then have the materials available if they wanted more information from ADEQ. But we had to be careful to stay in our lane, because our lane was to talk about the fire, not to talk about health concerns, because I'm not ADEQ and I'm not the health department. So we provided that information if the public had concerns and more questions about it.
Yes, sir.
When you started, when you came out and you made the decision that we're going to go ahead and manage the wildfire for multiple objectives, however you want to say it, did you interact with the air quality agency first to let them know that there was going to be a whole lot more smoke than they were expecting? Did you have to get approval from them first, or just did you notify them?
First of all, we did notify him there, and I would clarify, when we have wildfires that, whether we're managing them for resource objective or straight up wildfires, we're talking with Ron Sharon and ADEQ. This fire in particular, as we were transitioning into that type 3 mode, and we knew we were going to start doing aerial ignition, some mass ignition, we were talking to Ron maybe daily, maybe not quite daily, but he certainly had a heads up to what we were thinking about. And that tends to be the story in the northern Arizona forests. Ron is funded by the forests, and we're having that dialogue regardless of strategy anyways. You bet. Does that?
You don't need their approval first. You just notify them.
Yeah, it's been a few years. You know, a few years ago we were going through a semi-approval process. It was a dialogue. Right now it's simply a dialogue, and we let them know what we're planning. and then they'll have feedback to us. Maybe you ought to consider burning to this road. 3 days from now is a bad ventilation day, but no, it's not an approval. It's unregulated wildfires are.
Yeah, just a little bit on that. What generally happens on this fire, a couple other ones right around Murray Valley, Flagstaff area. When the fire starts, when the planning process starts, I get a call. Generally says, look, now that we have this call, it's on this call right after that. Look, this is what happened. We have a fire down below where the legal fire was. We're looking at maybe 11,000 acres. Once this gets started, we can't stop. What are your thoughts? Can you talk with DEQ? I'll go talk to DEQ, I'll lay out the maps, I'll show them, this is what the fields look like, this is an area of it's 40. We have some issues, parks, we have some other smoke sensitive areas. Let's look at the Verde Valley, what are the chances of it getting back towards the Verde Valley? And then DEQ will actually go through and say, okay, yeah, I think that's good. Make sure that the audience is targeted for each releases, that kind of stuff. Keep us posted. So then I'll call back to Forrest and say, okay, looks like we're all in on this. DEQ understands if we go, we're going all the way. They don't have any issues right now with it. If you need any monitoring support, you need any air quality support, let us know, and we'll come and we can do that. And then we'll go from there. And then it could be a couple more days before they get to go ahead and go out and do it. Generally, that's when, as soon as the planning, it's almost like there's a checklist. It goes down the planning process, and I'm on that list. Yeah, that dialogue is really important to making it a successful operation. So good to hear.
And we're down to like 30 seconds, so we have a quick one, Dave?
Yeah, I think the other thing too is just, you have to understand, especially for the wildfire, that, and I'm talking Forest Service, so that's the district rangers or the forest supervisor, the agency administrator's responsibility to decide if we're gonna keep that fire or we're gonna put it out. The key thing is practitioners or managers, we're collaborating, and what Ron described, we have to present that to our leadership. So we have to give them all the information they have available to make a decision on. No, I want you to go put it out, or no, I'm good. Let's take it on for 6 or 8 weeks.
All right, I think we're out of time.